if we're talking about Methodists, I should probably put his name right at the top. There's one guy who's particularly important, John Wesley. Anytime that you come across a college called Wesleyan, odds are it's coming out of the Methodist, Wesleyan, Holiness tradition. He had a brother too who was very important, Charles Wesley. If you've gone to churches and heard, fairly traditional church hymns, some of those are actually by Martin Luther, some are by other people, some are by his John Wesley's brother, Charles Wesley, who wrote a lot of hymns that were adopted by a lot of other people. And John Wesley started out in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And your book talks about some important experiences that he had. There were a lot of changes taking place. Think back to your, world history or early modern history. England is at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. What did the Industrial Revolution bring to people? Besides, great goods. Actually a lot of them were clothes. What were some of the negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution that you can think of? We don't have a lot of them, other than the pollution part, because we displace them to other places. Let me ask you this. What are some of the complaints people have about this particular piece of technology and the company that makes it? Ethical complaints.
Factory conditions.
Yeah, specifically what?
Like Apple in China and that whole scandal.
Yeah. Yeah, and what are they don't give them enough piped in music. They didn't
really give them anything at all. They had long days.
Yeah.
They're all cracked in on apartment buildings. And there were multiple explosions I remember hearing about too.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's young kids doing quite a bit of labor. In China, there's also the issue of prisoners. And that was used in the Industrial Revolution too. This notion about privatizing prisons and workhouses, not something new. It's been around for a couple hundred years. Labor conditions were quite bad. We've displaced that to other countries, so we don't see too much of that, except in food processing. But what we nowadays call sweatshop labor, that was the norm back then. There was no protection for workers. If you lost a hand in a machine, that was it for you. Hopefully your family would support you because nobody else is going to. And that's if you didn't die of disease or infection or something like that. Or if you didn't starve to death. Some places paid wages so low that you literally could not survive on them. And Wesley is concerned with this sort of thing. When you have conditions like that, if you want to preach the gospel to people and say Christianity is all about helping your fellow man or woman or child, and say Christ is about love and stuff like that, and you're dressed in really nice clothes and coming in on a Sunday, and the rest of the week these poor schmucks are working their fingers to the bone in horrible conditions, how well does that pan out? Not too well, right? It's sort of like if I, as a professor, were to complain about you guys not writing 70-page papers for my class, and I were never to publish anything, and say, you guys are so lazy. I don't think you'd go for that, would you? Probably not, right? You'd get angry at me. Well, if Christianity is going to mean anything to people in conditions like that, it has to take on different emphases than what the Church of England was going to provide them with. John Wesley is concerned with the poor, the people who don't fit into the sort of well-to-do Anglican spectrum, the workers. Once it gets to the Americas, people on the frontier were very attracted to Wesley's doctrine. Now, he didn't mean for it to go out of the Church of England. He thought the Church of England, if it's doing a good job, it should be trying to reach this. And it should also try to reach the religious affections. what we nowadays call emotion. If Christianity is going to be particularly meaningful to people, it can't just all be intellectual doctrines and dogmas and rituals. It has to have emotional meaning in people's lives, day after day after day after day. Otherwise, Wesley would say, what's the point of it? And I should also put here, besides workers, the uneducated. Wesley is emphasizing the emotions because he thinks that's part of a human being. That's a major part of you. I mean, think about it this way. You're not happy with all of your emotions, right? Sometimes you get scared or sad or angry. It's not a lot of fun being angry. Some people like being angry, but you have a lot of negative emotions. How many of you had your heart broken at one time or another? Willing to bet at least half the class, right? And the rest of you broke somebody else's heart. Willing to bet. Or you felt disappointed. Imagine I could give you a pill that would take all those negative emotions away. But you wouldn't feel any joy or excitement or other positive emotions. Affection for other people. You'd just be kind of numb and cold. Now imagine that you're living in really crappy conditions too. Would you take the pill? If I gave it to you for free? If not, why not? Why would that be a bad bargain? You know, our emotions are really part of who we are, aren't they? Do you feel like I should put it, do you think that they're important, or do you feel that they're important? There we already have that contrast between intellect and emotion, don't we? Somebody used the term passion. Yeah, you used it before with respect to education. If you don't actually feel any passion about the stuff that you're studying, it's harder for it to stick, isn't it? That's part of what a good lecture ought to do, is actually get you to feel as well as to think, get you interested. That's why so many people are bad lecturers, including myself sometimes, when I'm not, on my game. What about your major? Do you feel passionate about what it is that you're studying and preparing to do for maybe not necessarily the rest of your life, but for at least the next 20 years? I hope you do, because if not, it's going to suck. And I don't want that for any of you, especially when you're spending so much of your time and effort and money here to study it. Passion and emotion, those are very important. Those are an integral part of human beings. And Wesley was onto that. He thought that the Church of England had become boring. It had become, he didn't use the word boring, it had become sort of passionless, stultifying. He actually had some theological views tied in with this as well. And this leads us to this very important doctrine that he calls sanctification. Or another word for this is holiness. Sanctus just means, that's the word that we get saint from, it just means holy. So sanctification, becoming holy, these are really the same thing. And your book talks about, the early Protestants were really focused on justification. Who's saved, who's not saved. So Luther, right? Luther was really worried about, is he justified? Is he saved? And he felt like, look, I'm a monk and I'm doing all these prayers and it's not actually doing anything for me. I still don't feel like my sins are forgiven. What am I supposed to do? And then John Calvin, some people are saved, some people are damned. Some are justified, some are not justified. Wesley said, well, that's really just the first, that's the beginning of things. This would actually be about sort of progressive, let's call it progressive development of a relationship. With who? With God. So, a person can be closer to God or further away from God. And as opposed to, no worries about justification. Imagine if you believe in predestination. Well, you're saved or you're damned. You can work real hard and try to, do what the church tells you to do, and then you're probably saved, but you're not actually earning your salvation. There's nothing you can actually do to make it any better. With this is more Arminian. You actually have some role in how close you are to God. And how do you know whether you're closer to God? You can feel it. Your religious affections are raised. And sometimes that could be, painful. As a matter of fact, if you look at medieval saints and the way that they talk about God, some of these medieval saints were really great, men and women, but they would talk about their consciousness of their own sins and how loathsome they were. And sometimes when people get closer to something transcendent, they become conscious of their own limitations much more. Just like this is a totally different thing, but I realized that I was not as good of a guy as I thought once I had kids, and I had to take care of kids. You start realizing your own limitations, right? Well, that's all within the realm of religious affections, and sanctification and emotion kind of go hand in hand for Wesley. He talks about this as a second blessing, marked by the attainment of a state of holiness, a transformation of consciousness characterized by a state of freedom from voluntary sin. Meaning, once you're being sanctified, you could still fall, you could screw up, you get mad at your neighbor, curse them out, gossip about them. That would be a bad thing. But the idea is that the further you proceed into this, the easier it gets for you. Because, God's helping you out. God's working within you. And this fit in with a lot of the other things that were going on, like the revival in music that his brother Charles Wesley is carrying on. And another thing that the book brings up that's important to keep in mind, and we're going to talk a lot more about Methodists later on, John Wesley and Charles Wesley were really good organizers. So they're starting a movement. Originally, it's a movement within the Anglican Church. Now, eventually it's going to break away. Why do you think they would end up breaking away? Wesley was not, a big fan of that, actually. He wanted to stay an Anglican, just like Luther wanted to stay a Catholic. Do you think he was like Luther, where he said, look, I just cannot put up with this stuff that you're doing, and I got to take a stand here. I wish it didn't have to be like this, but I'm going to have to break with all of you. It wasn't quite like that. So if it's not the individual actually saying, or the movement saying, we're going to have to part ways, how else could it happen? What's the other alternative? Yeah.
If they're ostracized by the Anglicans.
Yeah. So tensions arise within the Anglican Church over this. And your book talks about some important developments that kind of set the stage. But that tension that's existing between sort of an established way of doing things and a new way of doing things that seems to have the vitality on its side, the movement on its side, that's underlying the split. Your book talks about Wesley appointing these people to offices. And so Wesley was seen by the Anglican Church as sort of interfering with church structure, with taking on roles of his own. He appoints this guy, Thomas Cook, a superintendent. Now, another word for superintendent is bishop. Within the Anglican Church, it's very traditional. They have bishops, and the bishops are consecrated by who? Other bishops, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. So for John Wesley to be setting this guy up, who eventually is going to take on, not just him, but also Ashbury, these traditional titles of bishop, that's going to cause some problems. And Wesley's not actually for this, but the movement comes to take on a kind of inertia or impetus of its own, as often happens, right? A lot of times the founder is not completely in charge of what's going on. And where your book ends up, sort of leaving off, because this is a to-be-continued kind of chapter, is saying these combinations of tradition, Anglican tradition, and innovative adaptation, going to new theology, going to new people, discipline and emotion, structure and flexibility, democracy and strong leadership that characterized early Methodism were powerful sources of appeal. This becomes a major force in the American colonies. And we'll talk about why as we get into later chapters.